Welcome, everybody. We're here for the University Neighborhood Safer Streets open house, kind of the first meeting in a series of open houses that'll ultimately happen for this area. Just wanted to thank you for taking your time out of the evening tonight. I know evenings are precious these days and it takes a little bit of your time. So we'll try and do this in an hour here and get you out of here and answer as many questions as we can. So thank you for being here. I want to give you a little bit of an orientation first. The first thing to know is that this meeting is being recorded. We'll post it on the website next week sometime, probably towards the end of the week. And you can certainly distribute that to other folks who haven't made it, but just wanted to let you all know that. And I know that Teams is a little bit different format than most people are used to. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an orientation here, give you introduction to the buttons and that Teams has. So at the top here, you can see on the screen, this is in the top right of your window, your Teams window. It has a chat function, and that's how the primary way we're gonna correspond back and forth today, but I know that we have some folks on the phone as well. So we're gonna try and describe everything really well to you. And for those folks on the phone, just a reminder, if you have access to email, you are also welcome to email bikes@denvergov.org, or sorry, DenverGov, yes. Here you go, denvergov.org. And we will certainly get your input that way as well. And we'll see kind of how the chat goes throughout the night as well. We also have this camera on and camera off. As I said earlier, you're welcome to have it on, certainly not a requirement. And the mic is off by default, just because of the way Teams is set up here. But like I said, open that chat window and you can give us input throughout the time. So if you're having any bandwidth issues, if things seem really choppy, in the 3 dots menu right here, there's a pull down that says turn off incoming video. And that'll just mean you hear us, but you don't see us and it doesn't take that bandwidth. So let's see, we talked about how we're gonna communicate back and forth, mostly by posting questions in the chat box. We will have Q&A breaks throughout, but we may be answering questions in the chat box that are simpler. And I just want to make sure you know that the main point of this meeting is to get input and to have that dialogue back and forth. It's tough in a virtual setting, but we'll do what we can. We'll also have a break towards the end here that we can, that you all can fill out a survey during the meeting or after the meeting. So lastly, on this piece, I wanted to make sure to remind you that you all are, likely neighbors and hopefully friends. So please be civil, even if there are differing opinions. We're all here trying to get, the best interest of the community in mind. So feel free to post questions on the tech side in the chat as well. We have tech folks on board that can try and answer your questions there. So a quick meeting overview. We're going to go through some intros and give you a little bit of background on why we're here and how these projects came about. A little bit about the existing conditions data we've collected so far. This your feedback piece here is not the only time for feedback. That's pretty much spread throughout. You'll have multiple opportunities. And then towards the end, we're going to talk a little bit about mobility plans and then next steps. We recognize that, you all have thought a lot about this area, so we want to make sure that we respect that as well. Give us the feedback that we've heard some of the feedback through other processes here as well, but this is kind of the first in a new set of meetings here. Wanted to introduce you to DOTI team of planners, designers, and engineers who've been working hard on this project and in this area of Denver. We have Ellen Forhofer, who is the planning lead for one of the most of the projects in this area, but the one we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about. We have Afor Chavez, who is community engagement, and she's going to be kind of driving some of the question coordination here. Lisa Eddington is behind the scenes. She's a project manager and engineer, and Bryce Hammerton is the engineering lead on this project. So with that, I will hand it over to Ellen for some of the background.
Thanks, Alicia. And again, thank you to everyone who's carving out some time this evening to be here. I noticed we do have representation from several council offices tonight as well. So thank you for your participation. Really appreciate your involvement in this project. And as Alicia mentioned, I will be walking through some of the reasonings and the background of why we are looking at mobility improvements in the university neighborhood area before handing it off to Afwar, where she'll speak about the university neighborhood safer streets in more detail and what all of those projects entail. Before handing it back to me, I'll dive into more details, particularly around South Bucktel and the plans for that corridor. So just to begin, wanted to note, it's no secret that Denver is growing quite rapidly. And as Denver continues to grow, Dottie is looking at ways that we can continue to move people safely and efficiently within our right-of-way, and largely making a goal to do that within the current right-of-way that we already have. And so part of that is now looking at how we can use the same amount of space more efficiently to move more people safely and comfortably throughout Denver. And on the next slide, we'll speak to these 2030 goals. Those are part of the Denver Mobility Action Plan. And this plan really sets some just very strong goals in terms of what our mode share should be as we continue to move forward and think about how we can use space within the city's right-of-way more efficiently to continue to move people safely throughout the city. We'll also with a mind towards sustainability and how we can continue in Denver to not only move people around the city, but do so in a more efficient and sustainable way. One other aspect of the Mobility Action Plan is a part of the Vision Zero cities. Denver is a Vision Zero city, which means that we aim to have zero traffic deaths by 2030. And that goal is closely aligned with the mode share goal in terms of shifting choice and offering more mobility choice for folks if you want to walk, bike, drive, regardless of how you're choosing to get around Denver. How can we offer more choices and make those choices safer as we continue to move forward as a city? And on the next slide, just wanted to talk through, a little bit more of that safety element. So we're looking at how we can not only increase the mode shift of people walking and biking, but also decrease crashes and design out some of those opportunities for conflicts on our streets as we continue to improve multimodal safety throughout the city. Again, as a Vision Zero city, this is a paramount to our work. It is a part of the foundation of every project. And on the next slide, I'll speak a little bit to what some of those constraints look like. So Dottie does manage the right-of-way. You can think of right-of-way as the space, where we move in our city. So travel lanes, sidewalks, bike lanes, bus lanes, lots of competing uses, just in naming a few off the top of my head of users of this space. And this is one of the most important public spaces within Denver. And so as Dottie continues to create more multimodal choice within the city, we are constantly looking at this constrained resource that we have within our right-of-way and how we can continue to understand how we can parse that out, really delineate the space so that regardless of how you're using our right-of-way and how you're choosing to get around Denver, you feel safe and comfortable doing so. And with that, I will hand it off to Afwar to speak more about the University Neighborhood Safer Streets project.
All right, thanks, Ellen. That's a good overview and a good reminder as to why we're doing a lot of the work that we're doing. Thinking about that right away too, I think the University Safer Streets is a good example of how we're going to try to manage that strategically and with our partners and in a collaborative way. So let's dive into some of the projects at hand here briefly tonight. There's a lot of plans, obviously, that some of you are very familiar with that have been identified, that help identify the projects in the area. So some of these plans, Denver Moves Pedestrian and Trails, Denver Moves Transit, and then the University Mobility Plan and Study. So these plans, they really are community driven. We've gotten a lot of feedback from folks around what kind of actions we need to prioritize that would help strengthen the connections and improve a lot of the safety and the ability to get around the University and Colorado Station areas. So these plans, they've identified projects but we need the funding to make them happen. And so we have a couple funding opportunities that have been available to us now, the CIP, and which is the Capital Improvement Program, and then the Elevate Denver bond program. And so with that funding, we're able to move some of these projects forward that have been identified through community and through these plans. And so this kind of grouping of all the projects that we see in this area are going to be labeled under this University Neighborhood Safer Streets. And these projects, again, identified for multimodal improvements in this area that you can kind of see down here on this map. And we'll go to the next slide and we'll kind of zoom in on that map and get a better sense of where we're at in this area. So as you can see here, this University Safer Streets area, we're talking this area that's kind of bordered by I-25 on the north and on the east, and then Williams on the west, and then Evans to the south. So the projects that we're really looking at encompassing in this University Safer Streets are identified to be implemented in the next 5 to 7 years. And that's a long time, but we've got some work that is coming up kind of a little bit more immediately this spring, summer, and fall. And that's really what we're looking to talk with you about tonight. That's really what's driving this meeting and wanting to make sure we're getting out and talking with you about some of these more immediate projects. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that one of the projects here is the Bucktale bike improvement, which Ellen will be diving into a little bit later tonight. But again, that's kind of one of the projects that's really driving this conversation this evening. And so we'll dive into that a little bit more. Just real quick then on the next slide, wanted to highlight several of the intersection improvements. There's going to be some major intersection improvements in this area that I'm sure many of you are really familiar with. They've been identified with community support. And those intersections, as you can see here, Bucktale University, Bucktail, Colorado, Evans and University, and Evans in Colorado. So those projects we will start going into design later this summer, and we will come back to community to have some really good, robust conversations, continue to get feedback in that process. But just kind of a quick overview and highlight of what's to come with those. Again, design kicking off this summer. And then so finally, just another group of projects that I wanted to share with you briefly here are some sidewalk construction and implementation improvements. There's 5 segments that we've identified through help from community, through community feedback on Denver Moves pedestrian and trails. And that along with kind of a tiered system that has helped us to prioritize what connections we need to improve near transit. That's helped us to identify some of these sections and these segments here in this area that are predominantly close to Evans, and they provide better pedestrian connections in that area. So real briefly, those segments there are South Milwaukee Street, South St. Paul, South Adams Street, South Cook, and then South Madison Street. So if you are in one of those areas or on one of those streets, you can expect to get some more information here soon and start to have some conversations with some folks on the Dottie side regarding what those improvements are going to look like. So that kind of outreach with community will be kicking off here real soon, and we expect to see spring, summer, fall, probably more summer, fall implementation with the sidewalk gaps being filled there. And then just kind of wanted to highlight real quickly here at the end, everyone's pretty familiar with all of the transit mobility options in this area. Obviously you've got the University Station, the Colorado Station, all those little icons there are the bus stops that we see in this area. And we are really aware of the desire that we're hearing from community for those safe connections, comfortable choices, multiple, mobility options. And so we're really looking to help enhance some of those connections and improve that comfort for folks as we move around the city. So we're really looking to give you guys more choice, and that's some of the things we'll talk a little bit more about this evening. So I think maybe a schedule is up next, and then we'll dive into the Q&A break. Yeah, so just a real brief highlight of what you can expect. Again, as we kind of talked about, we have the bike project, which is going to be, Ellen will dive into that here after the break. And with construction and implementation for that this summer to fall, a couple more opportunities or more opportunity for public input. And I think Ellen will probably also get into schedule a little bit more detailed on that. But then just wanted to compare that to kind of how we have the sidewalk gaps that will also be filled this summer and fall, and then also that design elements for the intersection improvements. So that hopefully gives you a good idea of what we can expect here in this area coming up in the immediate future. And then I think after this break, we'll kick it over to Ellen. So Alicia, take it away.
All right. So we have our first Q&A session here. We have at least a few questions in the chat so far. And I think the first one was from Nick, thank you, about kind of the breadth or the scope of this project, focusing on bike lanes. And Ellen hasn't gotten into that discussion, but maybe Ellen, you can do a little quick description of which section we're talking about and why we're, at least the first piece of why we're talking about that right now today.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia, and thanks, Nick. That's a great question. And just want to highlight, because I know that there is a lot of information that we just threw at you, but it's worth noting the University Neighborhood Safer Streets Initiative is a collection of projects that are much more than just bikeways. But again, to Afur's point, part of why we are having this meeting tonight is that there is a bikeway project as part of the city's paving coordination program. This is an effort on Dottie's part to be more efficient with our resources and also help us be out in the streets, disrupting them with construction and improvements as little as possible. So looking at our repaving program within the city and identifying where there are areas that are going to be repaved and are also identified as bikeway connections in Denver Moves Bicycles. And that part of the bikeway project, which I'll be speaking about in more detail a little bit later tonight, is on Bucktail from Corona, Florida, that kind of interesting intersection, all the way east to University. But you can see on the map here as well, there is an additional bond project from University to Colorado, which is different in scope from this paving coordination project. And we'll be kicking off more in earnest later this year. As Afur mentioned, there will be several projects that will continue to be out in the community speaking about, that multimodal improvement project on Bucktale being one of them, along with the sidewalk gap improvements, as well as intersection improvements that you can see here on this map. So just wanted to highlight some of the nuance there in terms of the Bikeway project and the different scopes. And I am happy to dive in a little bit later today about the scope specifically from Corona to University. As part of our paving coordination program, it's worth noting those projects, we really do stick within curb to curb right of way. So looking at what we currently have in terms of the laneage and how we can start to repurpose that space to provide those mobility improvements and safety improvements for everyone using the road.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. And I think there are one or two other questions. Thank you for sending them in that are along those same lines. And I want to make sure we get those answered, but I'm going to hold them until the next Q&A after we've talked a little bit more about the bike project in case it answers some of those questions as well. So unless anybody else from the panel has one more thing to point out, I think we can go ahead and move on to a little bit more focused discussion. Good. Okay. So close your eyes, we're getting back here. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Ellen here to talk about that kind of western portion of the bike project.
Great, thanks, Alicia. And as I just mentioned, this part of the meeting, we're really going to focus in and drill down on the bikeway improvements proposed for Bucktel Boulevard from Corona Street to University Boulevard. And as I mentioned, this is part of our paving coordination program. And on the next slide, we'll speak a little bit to how Dottie considers bikeway improvements as we continue to build out the network in our city. So in 2018, we did a statistically relevant survey of Denverites to understand comfort levels with the current infrastructure and the current bikeway network throughout the city. And what we found from that survey is pretty interesting. We found that only 16% of people feel confident or somewhat confident on the current infrastructure available to them and the current network connections available. And on the next slide, we'll see, what we gleaned from this survey is that there's a large percentage of Denverites, 75% in total, that would potentially ride a bike in Denver much more often if they felt more comfortable doing so. And so we are really looking at how we can continue to build out the network through our multiple implementation programs and opportunities to create that strong connected network of safe connections, comfortable connections, easy connections for people who are choosing to ride their bicycle. And the great thing about these improvements is that while, yes, safety of people riding bicycles is a top priority, there are also lots of benefits for people who are walking as well as people who are driving on those same streets. And so these truly are multimodal improvements as we're building out a network of more strong connections for people who choose to bike. And so building on that, we are looking at, as I mentioned earlier, citywide, how we can increase the combined walk by bike mode share, as well as increase the amount of people who live within a quarter mile of a high comfort bikeway. So that's looking at how many people are within a 5-minute walk of a high comfort bikeway facility that can then plug into a more connected network. So from that, we're looking at how we can provide healthier, more affordable, and more sustainable transportation options citywide. And we do have a goal over the next 2 years now, so through 2023, to build 125 new lane miles of bikeway facilities. And this is in an effort to really quick build that network so that folks feel more comfortable and feel that it is truly an option to get around for their daily needs in Denver. And as part of that, we're looking at how we can really develop those high comfort connections. So looking at bikeways in the sense of how can they serve people of all ages and abilities and really align with that interested but concerned group. So maybe a lower comfort level overall, how can we design our streets to be more comfortable for folks who are interested but maybe not currently biking on our streets? And so as I mentioned earlier, one of those implementation programs that we use to continue to build out a stronger and more connected network of multimodal improvements and bikeway safety improvements is our repaving program. So we partner with our operations team within DOTI to understand what the repaving schedule is across the city and align that with what our planned network connections are within Denver Moves Bikes. From there, it represents a key opportunity to implement some of those important connections while also being mindful and efficient with our resources so that we're not continually out in the street or potentially having to restripe something that was just repaved. It allows us to be a little more efficient as well as still making headway on that goal of having stronger multimodal streets throughout the city. So through this program, we aim each year to implement 10 or more miles of bikeways through that repaving program. And so with that, now that we have a little bit of background about kind of the history around the implementation program for this section of Bucktel Boulevard, let's dive in to talk about what this street looks like today, as well as what the planned improvements are through this program. So again, we are looking at East Bucktel Boulevard from Corona Street to University Boulevard. This section of roadway has a lot of major connections. The university as you near University Boulevard, as well as the University of Denver Station with RTD. There are also existing bikeways, at Franklin Street, as well as planned bikeways, which we anticipate to be installed beginning in 2022 on Florida Ave and South Franklin Street. So this will provide a really strong connection, both currently as well as with the improvements that we see coming down the pike with our planned connections. And that's through the South Central Community Transportation Network, that those bikeways on South Franklin and East Florida are moving forward. It also does fill a strong, just a gap in the network. So it provides a strong east-west connection south of I-25 that currently does not have a high comfort connection there. We're also looking at how we can make crossings along Bucktail lower stress through this project with a specific eye to Downing, Franklin, and University. And so on this slide, we are looking at the existing conditions of East Bucktail from Corona to Franklin Street. And as many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this area, the width and characteristics of the road change as you move along it. So just for those on the phone who can't see the slides, I'm going to briefly describe the existing conditions for different sections of Bucktel Boulevard. So in this section, this is the westernmost extent of the paving coordination project from Corona to Franklin. There is an existing bike lane, but only from Franklin to Downing Street. So there's not a continuous connection between both the existing bikeways as well as the proposed bikeways. And there's currently no buffer or protection of this bike lane between the travel lanes on Bucktel Boulevard. On the next slide, we'll move a little bit further east. So this is Bucktail Boulevard from Franklin to High Street. Currently, there is no bike facility in this section, and there are very wide travel lanes. So we're looking at travel lanes of 18 to 19 feet in some cases. And it's worth noting for context, typical travel lanes on a road vary between 10 and 12 feet. So these are very wide lanes, and that can sometimes encourage high speeds, which can then even further discourage people who are biking, especially since there is not currently a bikeway in this section of the road. And on the next slide, we'll talk about the easternmost extent of this project. So looking at East Bucktel Boulevard from High Street to University Boulevard. So this is the section of Bucktail that fronts DU. Currently there is a parking lane and 2 travel lanes in each direction. So again, same width of the street, but this is looking at more of that normal width of travel lanes. So we have an 11-foot and a 12-foot travel lane in each direction with parking on either side of the street. And so now let's talk about some more existing conditions, specifically what the crash picture looks like along the street. As I mentioned earlier, a goal of the paving coordination program certainly is to build out a stronger, more connected network of bicycle-friendly and bicycle priority streets throughout Denver. But we're also constantly looking at safety and how we can improve safety through all of our projects and multimodal improvements within the city. So crash data is something that we look at for all projects. If you're able to see the presentation on your screen tonight, you'll notice 2 orange dots on a picture at Bucktail and High and at Bucktail and University. This is where we've noted that there have been crashes that have involved somebody on a bicycle or someone walking. There have been 6 total of those types of crashes, looking at data from 2015 through 2020, so for the past 5 years. But there have been 108 crashes in total along the corridor, with 2 serious injury crashes and 1 pedestrian, unfortunately, seriously injured along this stretch of roadway. And so we take this into account, later on in the presentation, we'll talk about what the proposed improvements are, but we take this into account and really look at how at intersections and locations along the corridor where there have been crashes and conflicts, how can we potentially better design the street to design out some of that error and make it safer for everyone using the road. On the next slide, we'll also talk about some other existing condition data. So looking at parking data, we did collect information about the utilization of parking along this street where it exists. As we noted before, there are stretches of this road that do not currently have parking. as part of Bucktail. And worth noting, through our proposed improvements, we do not anticipate full repurposement or full removal of parking. There might be some slight exceptions at intersections to just improve visibility, but primarily throughout this corridor, we will be maintaining parking with where it currently exists on Bucktail. And then for a final existing conditions kind of report out, one other data point that we pay attention to as we design these improvements is speed of vehicles, as well as the volume of vehicles. So we did traffic volume and speed counts along this section of Bucktail. And we're looking at east of Franklin about 7,700 trips per day on average. Or excuse me, that's west of Franklin. East of Franklin, so between Franklin and University, that's a little bit higher, looking at 12,000 and change of average daily trips and vehicles. And speeds are pretty high. The posted speed limit is 30 miles per hour. But the 85th percentile speed, which is an industry standard in terms of understanding what that average speed truly is on the roadway, ranges from 34 to 38 miles per hour. And I wanted to call this out because in our next slide, we'll speak to what our improvements are. And we look at the speed and volume data to help us determine what truly will be the facility that is the highest comfort for folks in Denver choosing to ride their bicycle. And given the speeds as well as the volumes of traffic, we are proposing a mixture of a buffered and protected bike lane along this stretch of East Bucktel Boulevard. So that means that there will be a buffer space between a separated space for cyclists and separated travel lanes for people driving a car. And sometimes there will be protective elements within that buffer. So vertical bollards that further define that space and separate it between those two uses. So we're still in early concept design and determining what those improvements will be. Alicia mentioned earlier, we do have a survey open and we'll have time at the end of this meeting if you'd like to fill that out during this meeting or afterwards. But in that survey, we're really diving deep on what we think some potential changes could be and wanting to get community feedback to understand if we're on the right track and how that would play into those final designs. But overall, we are looking at a combination of buffered bike lanes and protected bike lanes to be that high comfort connection on this area of Bucktel Boulevard. And with that, I think we are at our next Q&A break. So I'll pass it back over to Alicia.
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks for everybody hanging with us through that piece of the presentation. So that's the technical Bucktail piece that I wanted to make sure folks were familiar with as we get into the next set of questions. But since I do see that we have some more questions about kind of the scope of this project, I wanted to ask Ellen first if you can remind us what are the boundaries of the bond project and what are the boundaries of this paving project and how do they connect to each other?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this paving coordination project is on East Bucktel Boulevard from Corona Street to University Boulevard. And the bond multimodal improvements project along Bucktail continues. It really picks up where this paving coordination project leaves off from University Boulevard to Colorado Boulevard. And that effort, as I mentioned earlier, will be kicking off in earnest a little bit later, but because our ops team gets out to repave really as soon as we have the nice weather that we're all, I'm sure, very excited for here soon, that is why we are a little bit staggered in terms of this paving coordination project and moving a little bit earlier than the multimodal bond project east of University.
Thanks, Ellen. And I also see that my team went ahead and posted one of the background projects, a link to one of the background projects here with the studies available if anybody wants to check those out as well to see what those limits are and how these projects came about. So, and then one other question too that I saw was about travel lane widths. Ellen, you mentioned 12-foot lanes, you mentioned 19-foot lanes. I saw some 11-foot lanes. What is the Denver standard for travel lanes and for this type of street? And when do we have 12-foot lanes or 11 or 10?
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, I will phone a friend here. Bryce, can you speak to standards across the city? And I just think it's worth noting, you know, the 18-foot, 19-foot travel lanes that we were seeing in the existing conditions, those are just very wide. And so that was part of the point of bringing up the standards. But Bryce, do you mind speaking a bit more to those standards?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Ellen. So we have a 10-foot minimum standard. However, in locations where we are seeing a lot of truck traffic, or if it's an industrial corridor, we will require updating that to at least 11 feet for our travel lane.
Great. Thank you.
And sorry, and if there is, if it's like a transit corridor, so if bus headways are less than 15 feet is if we need to, you know, increase that travel lane to 11 feet.
15, yeah, less than 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was another question too a little bit earlier about bike traffic demand and if that's how we plan these facilities. The question was, is bike traffic demand really that high right here? And whether there was, you know, traffic, sound, quality of life kind of considerations. And I guess the first thing that I will, before I think Ellen would be the right one talking about how these projects come about maybe back in the planning phase. I want to mention about isn't the sound quality of life study worthwhile? At that link that was posted, there is an additional study that's actually been done for this area that recommends these and other projects. So Ellen, do you want to talk about how the network is analyzed for where bicycle facilities are needed?
Yes, of course. Sorry, I had to find my mute button there. So it's a great question, and we do look at average bicycle counts in our projects as we build out the network. But that is not a prerequisite for building stronger connections. We're really looking citywide. How can we create a strong multimodal network of really comfortable connections? And so, you know, a lot of times there aren't a lot of people on these streets currently, but there's the opportunity for them to be. So we're really looking at what are the destinations that this corridor can link to? What are the existing and future planned bikeways that can really help to leverage this connection into being more than just about Bucktel Boulevard, but rather a strong connected network across the entire city that makes it easier to connect if you are choosing to ride a bicycle. And so while we do take you know, current bicycle demand into account, again, not prerequisite, and we're really looking at those vehicle volumes and speeds to understand and help guide us on what facility type is most appropriate so that we can really make those connections within the network really high comfort. And again, you know, kind of speaking to those earlier slides, you know, building for people who are interested but potentially not on a bike today, and really making the infrastructure align with that larger group of Denverites.
Thank you, Ellen. I did see, before we get back to one of the earlier questions as well, I did see a question about why 5 to 7 years. That's way too long, especially if it's paint. And I'm just gonna real quickly try and answer. And then I think that question was from Ian. Tell me if I'm not answering the right question here, if I'm not understanding you. The paint project that is part of the paving project that Ellen's talking about is planned for paving this year in 2021. The 5 to 7 year time frame is those other projects that need engineering, you know, grading and drainage analysis and things like that, a much more robust construction plans rather than just the paint project. So if that doesn't answer your question, feel free to ask it again. Excuse me. There was one more back, and this was Andrew. I told you that I would answer this question about, I think we should have answered this, but I just want to make sure we got it answered here, about unused green space. That would be perfect for multimodal improvements. And my guess is that that was asked before the extents of this project were understood. So please ask again if you have a question about this paving piece where the road's being repaved. So we want to see what improvements need to go on within just the piece that's being repaved right now while those other plans are being developed. We have more questions coming in here, and let me get caught up too. There was, I know, a question about a sound. I know that a lot of folks along here are noticing noise issues. And I can let Afor and Ellen answer that, but I think the initial thing is we have been hearing these, so it's not something that we aren't aware of. It's a little bit outside this project, but maybe Ellen, that would be a good one for you as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alicia. So we have heard, just from our research on the project, as well as some office hour meetings with folks engaged in the community about the prior efforts and conversations around noise studies specific to I-25. It's been, noted that there are noise mitigation, sound barriers north of I-25, but not south. And that is something that we have elevated and are continuing to look at, especially as we consider the longer term projects, as aforementioned, that are bond funded, and how we can coordinate those efforts with that concern raised by the community. But again, just want to highlight the paving coordination project, and one of the benefits of that is our ability to leverage an existing maintenance program to more quickly and more efficiently get safety improvements on the streets much faster than we would have seen them earlier. So again, just want to underline Alicia's earlier response of the paint and post elements of this project are within the paving coordination extent. So Bucktale from Corona to University Boulevard. And that scope of the project is different and moving at a different pace. But we are taking note of this feedback and looking for opportunities to continue to collaborate, coordinate, and dovetail with those efforts. And Afor, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add in that space.
No, that was great, Ellen. Thank you.
So there are a few questions on here also about what the protected bicycle protection is, and about the flex posts, the bollards. And I think, Bryce, maybe this would be a good one for you. So the question is basically, why bollards? What level of protection does that bring? And, why we landed on bollards versus a different type of protection.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for your question. So we have landed on bollards as a kind of standard for protected bike lanes as part of these bike paving projects. And that's mainly just due to scope and funding, just to get this in as easily as possible. However, there might still be an opportunity to upgrade that facility to include rubber curbs, which I'm sure you've seen at other protected bike lanes around the city. So that's something that we are going to be looking into design to see if that's something that can be added.
And if I can just jump in and add here, part of the reason that we look at materials like the bollards as well as rubber curbs, in addition to more permanent elements like cast in place curb or concrete curbs, those all have different price points, and as well as just different design requirements. As you start to put more and more permanent curbs along the road, there are sometimes significant drainage impacts, and that can really add into the total budget as well as timeline for a project. So again, part of the goal of these paving coordination projects is to get those safety improvements in faster than we would normally see them, and leverage the maintenance program that currently exists for repaving. And so that's part of why we consider that full spectrum of design materials and choose the one that really fits the need in terms of design intent, as well as the scope of the project and budget best.
There's a really good question here coming in about the use of the bike lanes. We call them bike lanes, and I know in many cities there are questions about what bike lanes are. Who can use them? You know, can you walk in them? Can you run in them? Can you scoot in them? Can you use a wheelchair in them? And maybe Ellen or Bryce, I think either of you would be great to answer this. So maybe Ellen, you can start.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. So the bike lanes, we're really looking at how we can design them to be dedicated space for cyclists, but we often do see them used by other users. And I'll defer to Bryce here if there's policy in that space.
Yeah, so as far as I know, in my experience, bike lanes are meant for bikes.
Okay. And I know that in most communities, and I don't know about this with Denver, the level of e-bike, varies on what kind of what class 1, class 2 e-bike is allowed. And I don't know, Bryce or Ellen, if you have an answer to that, but my guess would be that at least the 20-mile-an-hour cutout e-bike is allowed here, possibly the next level up as well. So scooters, I believe, can also use them, but again, somebody can confirm that. Bryce, you can correct me if I'm wrong as well. But those are all good questions too, because it kind of does play into one of the other questions that's been asked about off-street paths versus on-street bicycle facilities. And basically, who uses which and what are the benefits of each of those, and why are we looking at one here versus both or none? So maybe Ellen, you can take a shot at that about the off-street versus on-street here.
Yeah, of course. So we look at, again, opportunities of how can we create these safer connections, more comfortable connections, and build out that network as fast as possible. And it's worth here mentioning, the iterative approach to designing our streets within our cities. Different project types come with different constraints, as well as different price tags, right? So as we're looking at a project, like you mentioned, Alicia, of a separated or a shared use trail, if that often involves a lot of considerations, such as, do we own the right-of-way? Does right-of-way acquisition have to be a part of that? There's also much more stringent design as well as material costs associated with those projects. So because of that, they're typically considered longer term improvements, and we're not able to get those improvements in on the street as fast as, for example, in the paving coordination program. We're really looking within the right-of-way we already own, within curb to curb, so not really moving curbs as much. How can we repurpose some of that right-of-way to create stronger and more comfortable connections? But it's worth noting, that's a near-term improvement, and we are always open to feedback about what longer-term visions for corridors should be in the future. But just worth noting, given our different implementation programs, we are looking at the different scopes as well as budgets with those projects and what we're able to implement any given year. Does that answer the question?
I think so. And I think maybe one of the things we're going to have to move on here to finish out with just the schedule for this project, as well as potentially getting a survey filled out by you all. But before we get there, I just wanted to point out there have been a number of questions about a broader term vision for this piece of the corridor, and my guess is as well for the rest of the corridor. And just to point out, this is the first University Neighborhood Safer Street public meeting. As aforementioned up front, those other kind of orange highlighted projects, the bond projects and some of the surrounding projects, they're going to be continuous. There are going to be additional meetings coming up later this spring, most likely early this summer, I think, for some of those other projects. And these are absolutely things that are bigger picture. That's the time to talk about bigger picture issues and bigger picture concerns. And so I guess just a plug for those, we don't have a date for the next one yet, but please keep an eye out for that, because you can certainly bring up the questions there while we focused kind of between the curbs here for this stretch. So I think thank you for all the questions. I think we're out of time for questions for now. And here, as I scroll through, here we go. So the one thing I want to do before we get to that final schedule discussion, for the next 5 minutes, and I want you to come back at 6:57 because I really do only have 2 more minutes of material for you after that. But for the next 5 minutes, I guess it'll be 6:58, I would like you to go to bit.ly Bucktail survey. So for those on the phone, that's bit.ly/Bucktail survey. And I'd like you to take 5 minutes to fill that survey out. We can't hand you a piece of paper to give your feedback and answer your questions because we're not with you. This is a great way to do it. If you can fill it out and be back at 6:58, we'll finish up.
And for those of you that are joining through your computer or your phone and not just dialing in, Caroline did just drop the link to that survey in the chat. So you are also able to just click there and it'll link you to the survey. So thank you.
Okay, we're going to give you about 2 more minutes if you're still here and listening to us. Fill out that survey and be back in 2 minutes. Okay, just a couple more seconds here, and it's okay if you don't finish it right now. You can finish it later. This is a survey that's going to stay open for 2 weeks, and you are welcome to pass that survey link on to your friends and have them answer it. Get as much response, as much information as we can here. Okay, really quickly, since we have 2 minutes, I'm just going to say it looks like at least 5 or 6 people have finished the survey so far. So thank you for submitting those. And there are about even numbers of people who are biking and driving. We certainly have some walk and roll people, some transit, some scooter and shared bike type usage. So a pretty good mix of folks. A number of people, about 60% of people use it to commute through, 60% use it for recreation, and then also to go, shopping or access businesses, to access transit, which is a logical one along here, as well as some others. So, and the top concerns are the ability to feel safe while you're walking or on a bicycle, and then vehicle speeding. So we'll have more on the responses and answers to those surveys when we check in with you next, but really quickly in the last minute, I just wanted to go through the project timeline. And I think I'm going to cover this here just to be quick. Ellen, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, and just really quickly wanted to add in, I know there have been a few more questions I've seen in the chat related to the question about who can use bike lanes, and did just want to confirm, bikes, e-bikes, and scooters are appropriate uses for bikeways.
Great, thanks. And a note there also that class 1 and class 2. So the navy blue on the left side here is all of the projects and plans that have gone into this project. So we're starting with the light blue. We call it an educate and understand meeting because we're trying to hear info from you. We're trying to tell you what we've learned so far. And the next meeting is a design intent meeting, which just means that we're going to tell you a little bit more about what we've figured out in these first phases of design before we put it in. Late spring, we'll take that information from the design intent meeting that you all have given us, finish up the design. And summer here for install project is really a broad term. As Ellen mentioned, paving starts in March, April, and goes through October, and it's somewhere in that paving schedule, but we're still roughing out that schedule. So that's the rough feeling for the schedule. And Ellen, if I didn't miss anything else, the next steps here are just take that survey. Project website is bit.ly/Denver Bike Paving. And that'll get you almost any of these links. So you could go to just that one if you take one down or take a picture of the whole thing. We also have office hours with the project team. That means Ellen will be on there. You get to see her face again if you had a specific business that had a concern or you needed an ADA space discussion or something like that. That link is also on the Denver Bike Paving site, or email us at bikes@denvergov.org. So Ellen, anything else to add?
Just want to thank everyone for being here and call out, if you do email us at bikes@denvergov.org. We have several projects happening at once, so please do call out in that subject line, Bucktale Boulevard, and that will just help us make sure that we can respond appropriately and quickly to your questions. But again, thank you so much for your time this evening. Please take the survey, share that with friends. Again, that's bit.ly/Bucktail survey. And our project website is at bit.ly/Denver Bike Paving. Thank you all for your great questions and feedback tonight. And we look forward to seeing you later in the spring at our next meeting.